You're listening to the 2017 Nelson Arts Festival Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers programme. This session features Catherine Chidgey in conversation with Jacquetta Bell. Oh, hello everyone, welcome. A few more people sitting down. My name's Naomi Arnold, I'm the coordinator for the Readers and Writers program, and we're thrilled to have Page and Blackmore as our sponsor. Very grateful to them. It wouldn't happen without this wonderful bookshop, so thank you, Joe and the team. I'm extremely excited to have Catherine Chidgey here today. I just need to make sure I get the name of the prize she won this year right. She was a big winner at the Ockhams New Zealand Book Awards this year, winning the Acorn Foundation Fiction Prize for The Wish Child, which many of you will have read. And we're also excited to have The Beat of the Pendulum has just arrived in Nelson. I think it's here before anywhere else in the country. We managed to get them out of the warehouse early, so they're over at the book table if you'd like to have a look. That's her new novel. Jacquetta will be talking to her about that. The sessions will be podcasted, so if you'd like to listen to them after or listen to any other ones you might have missed, you can search for Page and Blackmore Nelson Readers and Writers on iTunes and you'll be able to experience the festival again. So warm welcome to Catherine, and I'll let Jacquetta take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. Oh, there's a bit of debate between Naomi and I about who's actually outlining Catherine's pedigree, but I think it pretty much speaks for itself, starting with the Fishbone Church in 1998 and several other novels and awards, including what do they call the Writers' Award where you get to have a year in Monton?
Oh, the Catherine Mansfield
Oh, the Catherine Mansfield Award,
Fellowship.
Of course, yeah.
Yep.
And the inaugural prize in modern letters, and then a bit of a gap that was well worth waiting for The Wish Child, which won, as Naomi said, the Acorn Prize for Fiction, which is actually an acorn, isn't it? A big acorn.
It is. I got a bright blue acorn to put on the sideboard.
So Catherine's been described as intelligent, lyrical, disciplined and observant, the real deal, the star of her generation. So I'd just like to thank you for being such a bunch of discerning readers and for coming along here today. And we'll just give Catherine a really warm Nelson welcome. So unusually for a New Zealand writer, Catherine set this novel, it's going to be a game of two halves, obviously, today. We're going to talk about The Wish Child and then The Beat of the Pendulum and then Time for Questions. So it's sort of a game of three halves. I don't know if you can have that, but a game of two halves in the aftermatch function or something like that. I'll shut up. Unusually for a New Zealand writer, Catherine set this novel in wartime Germany. I mean unusually because, we often think New Zealand writers, write about what write about New Zealand. I'll just give a wee sort of potted synopsis for people who haven't read it. Sieglinde, how do you say it? Sieglinde lives in middle-class Berlin. Her father is a censor who cuts prohibited words such as love and mercy out of books, and her mother responds to the bombing raids by making inventories of everything in the house. And Eric is an only child living a rural life near Leipzig, tending beehives with a father at the Russian front, a mother who mimes the daily farm tasks to her Polish farm workers, and an aunt who writes to a soldier fiancé she has never met. So Catherine, you've spent time in Berlin, so you are writing about what you know to a degree with setting a book in Germany. Can you tell us about that time and there's sort of two periods of time, I think, that you were in Berlin and how it influenced your choice of subject matter for this novel?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming along. This is a beautiful venue, and I understand it's a former convent, or the top bit of a former convent, so no wonder that I feel so at home here, being a former Catholic girl. Yes, I studied German right through secondary school and then did a degree in it at Victoria. And I had 3 months living in Germany, in Lüneburg, when I was 16, in between 6th form and 7th form. And then after I finished my undergraduate degree at Victoria, I had a scholarship to go and do postgraduate study in Berlin. And I particularly chose Berlin because the kind of duality of the place fascinated me. The wall was already down by the time I went there. I went there in 1993, but it was still very much a divided city. And I hadn't been quite prepared for how evident war damage was there still, especially in the former East. It was really like a time capsule. There were buildings that had been bombed and had just been left for decades open to the elements, never restored in any way. And even in the West, there were plenty of buildings that had obvious shrapnel damage, bullet damage. And I remember going to visit Sachsenhausen, which is a former concentration camp just to the north of Berlin, soon after I arrived there in 1993. And when I went there, all the old East German exhibition signs were still on display, so it hadn't kind of been overhauled after the fall of the wall, and they were quite... They had kind of a homemade air about them, and they focused exclusively on the atrocities committed by the Nazis under the Third Reich. But what they didn't mention was that after the war, it was still a concentration camp, and enemies of the state, so enemies of the East German regime, were incarcerated and murdered there. And they didn't mention that, just nearby in the forest there was a mass grave where tens of thousands of Germans had been buried who'd been murdered under the communist regime. So when I went back there a couple of years later, in around 1995, 96, I saw that those old East German signs had been done away with, and it was much slicker and much more sort of in keeping with other, Holocaust tourism. And
two words that shouldn't really go together.
No, they shouldn't. But that those other crimes that had happened since World War II were talked about. And I kept having experiences like that in Berlin, and I realised that it was a place where you can just keep peeling away layer after layer after layer to get to another story and another story and another story. So, it was a real gift for a new writer, someone who was thinking about how to tell stories. And it just got under my skin as a place and really wouldn't leave me alone. So I kind of knew that one day I would write a Berlin novel. It features in a small way in my first book, but I did always want to tell a fully German story and a story set in Berlin.
Thank you. Last Sunday on RNZ, Jim Moore interviewed Richard Harris, he's written The Fatherland, now he's written Munich, I think it's just the run-up to the war. And he said to Jim that his own fascination with the period was because it still shapes the modern world and tells us so much of what a country and human beings are capable of. Do you think that's kind of true? Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. We do keep going back to that period in history. We do keep wanting to kind of pick away at it and to try and figure out how what happened. When I was growing up, my father was absolutely obsessed with World War II because he had been a boy during the war. And so there were always books around our house about the war, and in particular about Germany and about Germany under Hitler. So I think that's partly where that fascination came from. But it also troubles me that there is a generation growing up now who don't know very much about it. And, I think it's important to keep returning to those stories and to keep telling those stories and talking about what happened so that it won't be forgotten.
They say history belongs to the victor, and it does seem that it's taken some time for literature, for us in English to be reading literature that's about the German side of World War II. And I've thought in my recent reading of books such as All the Light We Cannot See, the Gustav Sonata, now The Wish Child, and a few years back, The Book Thief. If you're telling the German side from a children's point of view, you don't have that burden of guilt. They're innocent. They couldn't do anything about it. Not that adults could either, really. But Was that part of the appeal in choosing child protagonists?
Yeah, that definitely was part of the appeal. I mean, the story is also the story of their parents, of Erich and Sieglinde's parents. And I was drawn to child protagonists because they were of that generation who were totally guiltless, but who were sold this gigantic lie. You know, they were sold this fairy tale that Hitler was this kind of kindly, avuncular figure who would save Germany. And they absolutely believed it, and so did a lot of their parents. But they, you know, swallowed that without question. And so after the war, felt tremendously betrayed. You know, that generation is of huge interest to me, and I talked to lots of Germans who'd been through that when I lived there. And yeah, there was this sort of generalised feeling that that they'd been lied to, that they'd been promised this fairy tale future that was never going to happen. One of the really early seeds for the book was when I was living in Berlin, and my then German boyfriend happened to tell me that, so he'd grown up in Berlin, and he said, one day I was out digging in the garden with my brothers and sisters, and we dug up some toy soldiers from World War II, and they were dressed in Nazi uniforms and they had swastikas. And I was really shocked by that. At first, I was really shocked by that. But then the more I thought about it, the more it seemed totally in keeping with what a child would have been given to play with at the time. And you can go onto eBay now and you can find lots of examples of those sorts of toys. And, you know, they would have been as common as a McDonald's toy is now to a child. And there's something really insidious and troubling about that. And that thought and that image of those soldiers really wouldn't leave me alone either. So they make their way into the book in a small way too.
Is this a good time for you to give us the treat of a reading, please?
Sure. So the piece that I'm going to read to you is a section that deals with Erich, the boy. So he's living on the family farm, and his father is away fighting on the Russian front. But he, so it mentions a bronze head in this section, which is the bust of Hitler that his mother has sort of created this little shrine to. And it mentions Oma, who is his grandmother, and Tante Uschi, who is his aunt. One still day in December, when the bees huddled in their hives and the cows huddled in their stalls and the geese hung by their necks, Mama and Erich went to the market. "Which one?" asked the fishmonger, his long black apron as slick as an eel. Erich peered into the barrel and tried to choose a fish. It was hard to tell one from another. They twisted in the water, feeling their way along the smooth, wet wood over and over, looking for a way out. Their scales caught the light like falling coins, and he thought of the time his mother had given him a pfennig at the lake and told him to make a wish. He did not know what to ask for, what shimmering future to imagine for himself, and yet Mama was watching, waiting for him to open his fist and let the coin go. "Well, young man," said the fishmonger, his net poised. "That one's nice and fat," said Mama. "What about him?" Already the fishmonger was dipping his net into the barrel and saying that Erich had made a fine choice, and the carp was shivering in the icy air, watching Erich with its white-rimmed eye, its mouth opening and closing as if it could not remember what it wanted to say. At home, Mama filled the bathtub, and the carp all but leapt from the bucket and into the cold water. "It will be your job to look after him," she told Erich. "What does he eat?" "Nothing," she said. "You mustn't feed him. We want him to be nice and clean." "He's already clean. He lives in the water." "We need him to be clean on the inside," said Mama. "That's a very important thing to be, for fish as well as for boys." Erich knelt and watched the carp. It kept its distance to begin with, staying at the far end of the tub, but Erich could understand that. Sometimes he felt uneasy in this bare room himself, with its glinting tiles, each one a milky mirror that warped his faint reflection, changing him into someone he was not. This is what he does not remember: the bare wooden stool, the women in white, the glittering calipers about his skull. He dabbled his fingers in the bath, and after a time the fish came to him, passing beneath his outstretched hand like the shadow of a cloud, impossible to catch or keep. It did not touch him, but he could feel the water shifting against his palm, rearranging itself. Erich knew what the world looked like from beneath the water, how everything wavered and blurred. He could hold his breath for over a minute, lying quite motionless, eyes open, tiny bubbles catching on his arms and legs, his ears, his lashes. One day his mother had come in when he was submerged, but she did not look like his mother, and although he could see her mouth moving, all he could hear were distant notes, a bird trapped in the eaves. Mama had been saving sugar and flour for weeks, putting it aside into special tins that Erich was not allowed to touch. It was their duty, she said, to have a normal Christmas, even without Papa, even though, when the wind blew in the right direction, they could smell the smoke from the bombs that had fallen on Leipzig. The house filled with the aroma of hazelnuts and cinnamon, cloves and almonds, and Mama tucked her hair under her headscarf and hurried about the kitchen as if there were an emergency, kneading sweet brown dough and cutting it into fir trees and stars, pinching pieces of sugary white mixture into crescent moons. The shapes were the shapes of a still night in the forest, and Erich wished he could slip through his bedroom window when Mama was asleep and go to the forest beyond the farm and stand in the fragrant dark, looking up through the black branches. But it was not safe there anymore. It hid runaways and traitors, all manner of enemies, bad shadows waiting in every hollow. In the tub, the carp was growing. When they needed to bathe, Erich caught it in a bucket and set it aside, and it waited, curled like a question mark, until he poured it back. At night, he could hear it splashing, leaping from the water, and each morning he had to dry the bathroom floor so that nobody would slip and break their neck. The fish was calm then, barely moving, but it came to him when he beckoned it, nudging at his fingers as they fluttered beneath the water. And in the mornings, too, Erich saw Mama saying her prayers to the bronze head with the blank eyes. It glinted just as the carp glinted, although it was not a living thing. No, it was not alive, but its eyes watched without iris or pupil, and you could not tell where they were looking. On Christmas Eve, Mama killed the carp. She took a hammer, the hammer Papa used for fixing things, and she killed it, and then she cut it open, and it was not clean on the inside, even though it had been in the bath for days, and Mama was wrong. Erich wept for the fish, lying on the sofa and burying his face in the tasselled green cushions, where everything was soft and cool and dark, and he could not hear Mama saying that German boys should be brave, that German boys should know some things had to die. He could feel his grandmother stroking his back, and where she stroked, fins appeared, and he swam into the soft darkness, the tasselled weeds parting for a moment to let him through, then closing behind him. That night at dinner, Mama lit the candles and sat in Papa's chair. She placed the fish at the centre of the table, its fins and tail as brittle as sycamore wings. Erich could see the slit along its belly and the filling of onions and parsley leaking onto the dish that had belonged to Mama's Mama, who was dead. The little wooden angels hung on the tree, angels in sleighs, angels playing trumpets, angels doing things that people do. And this was not at all strange, because angels were dead people after all, and why should they not remember how to play trumpets and ride in sleighs? Erich wanted to ask Olma if angels had memories, but Mama was peeling back the skin and cutting up the fish, cutting a slice for Olma and for Tante Uschi and for Erich and for herself, and telling him to say grace. He did not want to thank God or anybody else for the thing that lay before him, and so he said the words with his eyes open and his head unbowed, and when he had finished, Mama said, Amen, just as she did when she finished her prayers to the head. and then she began to eat, plucking the fine bones from the flesh so that she would not choke. Erich pushed his fork into a piece of the carp and raised it to his mouth, and his mother smiled, and the candle flames shook, and the shadows climbed the walls, and the snow fell, and the hollow head watched like a father. And Erich knew then that the hand holding the fork was not his own, and nor was the mouth receiving the food. It was a different boy who placed the warm morsel on his tongue, a different boy who chewed and swallowed, and asked for more.
Thank you. I've possibly been overthinking this because I knew you'd chosen that passage, but it's metaphorical. Well, it crops up again and is retold by Erich later, and you also use the fish bones and the fish eyes in another part of the book. What is the metaphor?
I chose that piece too because it has kind of emotional resonance for me. It's kind of a nod back to my first book, In a Fishbone Church, where there's a scene where the mother in that book walks inside a fish that her husband has caught, and those characters are based on my parents. So there's kind of this, I don't know, this sustained metaphor that's popped up in The Wish Child as well. It's a metaphor for everyday cruelty, I think. And in thinking about my father, who was the loveliest of men, but also a keen hunter and fisherman, and when I was growing up, I was terribly upset by, that kind of casual violence that the whole, all of Dad's family engaged in. And I remember Dad was going shooting one time when I must have been about 7, and at that stage my favourite animal was the rabbit. And Dad had shot a rabbit on this hunting trip, and he cut off the tail and gave it to me because my favourite animal was the rabbit. And I was so traumatised by it, and that really stayed with me because I couldn't quite reconcile this lovely man who was my dad with like I say, this sort of casual cruelty that was happening for cruelty's sake. So I sort of had all that in mind when I was writing that scene with the carp. I also knew from my research that it still is common in some parts of Germany to do that, to buy a living carp at the market before Christmas and to keep it in the bathtub. And I was, as a vegetarian, I was horrified when I found that out, but also knew that, oh, yes, that's a really good detail. I'll have to work that in somehow.
Right. I was kind of taking from it also that thing where, Erich eats the fish and asks for more. It's kind of like, in the end, we're sort of self-serving and go with the crowd around the dinner table. Yeah,
that's definitely part of it too, that although he's horrified and upset by what happens to the fish, in the end, he swallows it too. Yeah.
So also in that passage, you reference this bronze head and Mama praying to the bronze head. And there's a bit, throughout the book of Hitler as almost like a religious figure. There was one bit I particularly wanted to ask you about, where you talk, there's a whole sort of list of places he is present, and it ends with, he's in the church. Is he in the church? Is he in the stable watching the manger? Is he the bringer of good news? Meaning?
Well, he was embraced as the Messiah. That's what I mean in that particular section, and it's not too much to say that he was worshipped, that people did have shrines. Women in particular had shrines like the one Erich's mother has. Something I also stumbled over in my research was a picture of a factory where the bronze busts of Hitler were made, and they were lined up on a table beside a window, and there were these women, these German Hausfraus, who were polishing them and kind of being quite tender towards them was what I saw in that photo, and quite respectful towards them. And so that's why the bronze busts worked their way into the book. But so he was embraced as a messiah, but there was also this kind of disturbing sexual energy around Hitler. I read a book as part of my research, which was compiled letters that German women had written to Hitler, throwing themselves at him basically and saying, I will have a child with you for the Reich, name the time and the place. Really troubling.
Not just German women, because there's the Mitford girls who were hurling themselves at him in the run-up. Can you? I'll go back to the factory thing, but can you just tell us a bit more about your research, like, the samovar and that sort of thing of auctions? How did you come across that?
So in the book, there's an auction of household goods that Sieglinde's mother attends because she's seen it advertised in the newspaper, and she's happened to see that one of the things that's being sold there is a samovar, so one of these Russian tea urns, and her sister-in-law has one and she's always coveted it. So she goes along to the auction thinking that she'll get a nicer one. And I found out about those auctions when I was basically trawling through newspapers of the period, and you saw these little sale notices in the classified ads, and it would say auction of household goods, and it would list the sorts of things that would be for sale, and then it would have often a residential address rather than an auction house. And I found out that these were sales of Jewish Germans who'd been deported, and it was kind of horrific that very often, you would still see food in the cupboards or clothing in the wardrobes, and it was obvious that the place had been left in a hurry. And I also found photographs of German, ordinary people. That's a phrase that I use at various points in the book. Ordinary people, ordinary Germans, attending these sales and bidding like crazy. It was a feeding frenzy to get your hands on a bargain. There were, obviously there were shortages at the time, and the shops didn't have much in them to buy. So these auctions were a chance to, basically profit at someone else's expense. And that was, that really stayed with me too. And when Sieglinde's mother goes to this auction and she does buy the samovar, on some level she knows. She pretends that she doesn't know, or that it's kind of outside her realm of understanding what this auction means and where the original owners have gone. But on some level she knows, and when she's going home on the tram and she has this silver urn in her lap, she looks at her reflection in it, and her reflection is kind of distorted and pulled into different kinds of faces, and she sort of doesn't recognise herself. And I am really interested in, like I said, the children of that generation, but I'm equally interested in the parents of that generation who, we grapple endlessly with that question of German knowledge of war crimes, and I don't think it's something we'll ever get to the bottom of, but it's something that I, as a writer, enjoy turning over and over.
It brings up that question, what would you do? What would you have done?
Yeah.
And that's part of our fascination with it, I think. And also, the samovar, the auction, the household effects, it's all so Western middle class. It's not Pol Pot, it's not... it's people going to piano lessons, and they often in the movies the scene setter is the normality of life before the arrests and the raid and what have you.
Yeah, I wanted to. I mean, I guess I don't use the word Holocaust in the book. I use the word Jewish twice, and both times it's the narrator using that word. But that huge event is kind of kept in the wings. I didn't want to confront it head on because I think you can be much more effective and chilling sometimes if you don't. But I wanted to give a sense of these terrible events happening in the wings, so that, for instance, Sieglinde's mother imagines that their living room is gradually getting bigger, that the wall is gradually moving and making their living room, their living space bigger. And she starts to kind of question her sanity as to, whether this is actually happening. She keeps hearing these noises at night, and when she gets up to look, it seems as if the wall has just slipped further away a little bit. And the unspoken implication is that their Jewish neighbours on the other side of that wall are gradually being squeezed out. But when she asks her husband whether he can notice anything strange, he says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And I just wanted to use events like that are almost magical realism to talk about, one, the absurdity of the times, but also the way that these terrible things could happen so gradually and can kind of creep up on people so slowly that you don't really notice they're happening until it's happened and it's too late and their neighbours have disappeared.
You mentioned the bronze heads busts being made in a factory, and what I wanted to get onto was it's not a straightforward narrative arc really, and one of the ways the story is told is through these visits to factories. The children in Sieglinda's class are taken on factory visits where the teacher is telling them how lucky they are to be German children and be eating proper biscuits and not, nasty sort of flour and water biscuits like the British children. But as the story evolves, these factory visits they reveal more of the Holocaust in the background.
Mm. Yes, that was another way of talking about the sort of mounting horror was with the factory visits. So they take the form of monologues where the children don't actually speak, but you can kind of understand how their teacher is talking to them, and she sort of teaches them useful words that are kind of at odds with the words that Sieglinda's father, as a censor, cuts out of books. So it's as if those words like love and mercy are being replaced by other words like superior. And as the novel progresses, the products that each factory makes become more and more sinister. So it starts out with a trip to a German biscuit factory, and it's quite cheerful, and the teacher talks about how Hitler loves, having a biscuit like this with his cup of tea, and it's all quite jolly. And they go, I think next they go to a radio factory, and it's made very clear that every household must have a radio so that they can hear the Führer's words in their living room. And then they go to...
but it's not tunable to other stations.
No, and that's true. Mm. Yeah, that's true. The Volksempfänger, so that the state radio was only supposedly only able to be tuned to the approved stations. And they go to a factory where the yellow fabric is made that the Jewish stars are printed on. They go to a factory where medals for being wounded in the war are made, until finally the last factory they go to is where human hair is processed. And still the teacher's focus is on the ingenuity of German factories and that, isn't it marvellous that this material can be made into felt and mattresses and socks to keep our soldiers' feet warm when they're on the Russian front. And at the same time as she's kind of praising the virtues of German industry, she's always also catching herself when she says something unapproved that the children might, pass on to the wrong person and might denounce her, because it did happen. Children did denounce their teachers, denounce their parents. So there's this uneasy tension with those monologues on the part of the teacher between bright and breezy and jolly and talking about how wonderful Germany is, and at the same time being terrified of what might happen in this wonderful Germany.
Mm. And what about Frau Miller and Frau Muller? They progress the narrative in another way.
They do, yes. So there are these two German housewives who I really had in mind the dyed-in-the-wool Berlin Hausfrau that I got to encounter when I lived in Berlin. And within Germany itself, true Berliners have this reputation as being quite prickly and spiky and unfriendly and argumentative. And I definitely experienced that when I was there. And in the run-up to the 1936 Olympics, which were held in Berlin, Goebbels obviously recognised this too, because he decided that we're going to have all these international guests flocking to Berlin for the games, and we don't want Berliners to be Berliners, so we don't want them to sort of be as spiky as they usually are when we're on show. And so he announced that there would be a week of jollity leading up to the Olympic Games, and everyone had to be sort of polite to each other and kind to each other and smile more than they naturally would. And those kinds of gifts of research really feed characters like Frau Miller and Frau Müller, and they feed into those kind of moments of absurdity that I wanted to tease out in this book, which is the story of such a strange and absurd and unimaginable time. And so Frau Miller and Frau Müller, like the factory visits, sort of pop up at intervals throughout the story. And while they're friends, they're also like the teacher, conscious that one could denounce the other and that they don't want to say the wrong thing and that they don't want to make a joke about Hitler or something as terrible as that. And I guess I was wanting to include them partly as a kind of, to have moments of comic relief. I did laugh, I did have fun writing those sections, but they're also quite dark too. There's a sort of a melancholy and a dark undertow to those sections. At one point they're quoting lyrics from Mahler's Songs for Dead Children to each other, although the reader doesn't know that, but I know that.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to another secret, the narrator, and you were quite determined that this figure should be anonymous. I reread The Wish Child in preparation for this session, and I actually thought I did get more from it knowing who the narrator was, and I just wondered why it's important to you you don't want to do a spoiler and give it away here, I guess, though probably a lot of people have read the book by now, but why is it important to you that figure remains a shadowy one?
So that figure is a real historical person, and the book was going terribly for quite a few years, just not really working, failing to fire, until I happened upon a mention of this historical figure in a documentary about World War II. And it was one of those aha moments when you just know as a writer that this is the key to unlocking the story, this is the way to solve it. And so I decided I wanted that voice to narrate the story, so he can see into the minds of the other characters, Erich and Sieglinde and their parents, but he can't interact with them. And he opens the book. So at the very start of the book, there's a quote from Goethe's famous play Faust, which is about a man who sells his soul to the devil. And I decided that I wanted to have a quote from the devil before the book proper started. So I have Mephistopheles, the devil, saying, everything created deserves to be annihilated better than if nothing began. And then I begin anyway. So I begin with this voice of this mysterious first-person narrator who starts telling his story and the story of these children anyway. And that was very deliberate, that I wanted to start with sort of, the voice of evil, and then to have my narrator coming in and saying, I don't care if you say it's better if we didn't even bother, it's better if nothing ever started, I'm going to start anyway. You find out towards the very end who that voice belongs to. Part of it is just because of, wanting to maintain narrative tension and to keep people turning the pages, but also because his story was one that had been lost to history, or that had disappeared through the cracks. And when I found out about him, or heard that very fleeting mention of him, I rushed away to find out as much as I could, but it was very difficult to find out what his story was. And in fact, we probably never will know his true story because records were destroyed. People don't particularly want to talk about it. And that was quite frustrating to begin with as a writer, not to be able to get to the bottom of the story. But then I decided actually that's kind of a gift, and I can use that fluidity and that mystery to bring something of a mystery to the book. He's kind of an empty vessel that I could fill with a story that might have been his.
Right, well, thank you. And the pendulum's beating away. So we better move on, I think. So we've got it on display here, Catherine's new novel, The Beat of the Pendulum, which is fresh out. We've got advanced copies here today, which is, but we thought we might be just taking orders, but we've managed to get some here. So it's the result of a year. There's a chapter for each month. It's called a found novel, and you drew upon the language that you encountered day by day, such as news stories, radio broadcasts, continuity announcements, messages from the internet, and a lot of conversation. So what attracted you to this concept of a found novel?
So I teach creative writing, and I'd been talking to my students about found poetry, which I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of, found poetry. If you don't know what found poetry is, I'll give you a quick description. So it's where you decide, okay, I'm going to use this particular text that already exists, say one that Bill Manhire used to give to his students was the racing pages in the newspaper. So I'm only allowed to use words that I find on the racing pages, and I can take out whatever I like, I can delete whatever I like, but I can't add any words that aren't on the racing pages. And out of that raw material, I will fashion a poem. You can add punctuation, nothing else. And so I decided that I would give a found novel a go. I'd got to the end of The Wish Child, and it had been 13 years in the writing, and I knew that I wanted to do something totally different for my next book, something that wasn't a historical novel and didn't involve enormous amounts of research, and something that wouldn't take 13 years again. So I guess the other thing that was happening at the time was that I found myself in my mid-40s and didn't quite know how I'd got there. And I felt like I'd kind of wasted all this time. I'd wasted 13 years when I could have written 2 or 3 books, and I hadn't, partly because life got in the way. My husband and I had finally had our daughter, and she was going to be turning 1 in 2016, and my mother was going to be turning 85 that year as well. My mother is in the kind of moderate stages of dementia and is beginning to lose memory and lose language. And my daughter was just beginning to lay down memories and just beginning to understand what words were. And I felt like I was, in between those two people and looking in either direction. So I was very aware that time was galloping by, and I wanted to somehow bring to the page a feeling for that sense as we get older of time beginning to speed up and up and up, and that kind of urgency to grab at it before it's lost. So I decided that every day would be a representation of that in some way. And those raw material sources that Jacquetta mentioned were what I took as kind of the scaffolding. So I made a deal with myself that I had to create an entry for every single day of the year, and it wouldn't be a traditional novel, it would be kind of an immersive experience. So as the reader moves through these entries, voices start to emerge and start to become clear. So the voice of my husband, my voice, my mother's voice, and Alice, my daughter's voice, although she doesn't have much to say.
Because there's no speech marks.
There's no he said, she said.
He said, she said. So it takes a while to pick up who is who.
Yeah. And you can see, my mother deteriorating over the course of the year as Alice is beginning to sort of speak more and more. The title, The Beat of the Pendulum, is a quote from Proust, who is talking in Search of Lost Time about how novelists have to wildly accelerate the beat of the pendulum in order to simulate the passage of time on the page. So yeah, this is kind of my attempt to catch on to each day, even though we're doomed to lose each day. It's kind of paradoxical. I knew that it was an experiment that was doomed to fail, really, because we can't hold on to everything that we want to. We can't possibly remember everything we want to, but we can remember snatches, and we can try to create something beautiful from those snatches, which is what I was trying to do with this book.
So was there any discussion with Fergus Barrowman at VUP about it being called a novel? Did you toss around the idea of memoir or diary? Because it's not a novel in the way that we usually think of a work of fiction.
No, it's genre bending. It is, and as I was writing it, I always thought about it as my found novel. That's what I called it. That's what the file was called on the computer, and that's what Fergus agreed that it was too. But yes, clearly there are elements of memoir and diary, strange kind of distorted diary entries as well. Although I will say that although Catherine Chidgey is in there, she is and isn't me, and the mother in the book is and isn't mum. It is a kind of a hybrid. It is verbatim, but I've twisted and distorted and crafted.
Could you give us a taste, please?
Yeah. So this little snatch was taken from a day when my husband and I took our daughter Alice, who was not quite one, to an exhibition of Fiona Paddington's photographs in Auckland.
And she's the artwork on the cover, isn't she? The artist.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this beautiful cover, which I absolutely love, is one of Fiona's works, and it's an extreme close-up of a butterfly wing, and not just any old butterfly. It's a butterfly that was caught by Nabokov. So Fiona had access to Nabokov's butterfly collection in a museum in Switzerland and did this amazing series in 2016 of Nabokov's butterflies, and it seemed the perfect image for a book that is about, trying to stop time. Something as fleeting and as ephemeral as a butterfly wing seemed the perfect image for that, and also because Fiona appears in the book. So this is a little mash-up from us going around the exhibition. Time to expose the baby to some art. She thinks it's a game. Fiona Paddington's photographs are attuned to death. I've got the wrong glasses. Oh, dead things. I don't want to see the dead things. Death permeates this entire exhibition, larger than life. It would be amazing to have one of these on the wall, wouldn't it? Well, not that one. I don't like that one. One without dead things. I'm following you. You keep walking away. The post-mortem cast of an infant child done by the father. The opium jar. The woman entangled in the seaweed. The Marquis de Sade's skull. Surrender to the power and potency of photography. Are you running away from me? The cast of a man with severe tertiary syphilis. Let that be a warning to you. In the 1980s, Fiona Paddington was seen as a feminist. That's an odd thing to write, as if she's left it behind. She uses the phrase, a beautiful hesitation, to describe photography's power to arrest time. You're going too fast. Did you see the one of the guy holding the rooster? Nice cock. She really does master light. Take a photo of her next to that. It's going to be too dark. She's got demon baby eyes. Next to that then. Alice, 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 Alice. Where's Mummy? Where's Mummy? Have you taken it?
So can you tell us how you went about collecting the material? You talk about using your iPhone. So you were recording conversation. Did you always ask, or in the eavesdropping kind of, people on the bus sort of recording, did you just nab it?
Mainly I asked. With my mother, I was sort of in the interesting position of having to ask all year because I would explain my writing project to her and she would say, "Oh, yes, dear, that sounds interesting. Yes, of course you can record me." And then, 2 days later, I would say, "Can I record you, Mum?" And she wouldn't remember what it was for. So, in a way, I'm glad that I kind of was able to make those recordings while I could. So even now, she's sort of deteriorated a little bit more, and I've got all these recordings of her voice, which I'll keep. But the more anonymous ones, like there are a couple at the warehouse or in the queue at the supermarket. I thought it would be really weird if I asked permission for those. So I didn't for those, and those recordings are obviously not, you can't identify who those people are. So I felt okay about not sort of tapping the woman in front of me on the shoulder and saying, "Excuse me, just before you buy your bananas, would you mind?"
So when you did ask, what I was going to say is, research can be skewed by the presence of the researcher. Did you feel that people changed what they were going to say, like your friends? Obviously your family got used to it, your husband and your mother and so on, but the nurse who gives you the cervical smear, for example, do you think that the language they used or their behaviour or anything was coloured by knowing you were rolling a tape?
Yeah, it's impossible for me to answer that. I mean, probably, but that's kind of part of the experiment too. There are some kind of overly self-conscious moments in the book where I talk about the fact that that I'm recording you. And there are a couple where, so with my friend Tracy Slaughter, for instance, there's one where she's told me this story that's really grabbed me, but I didn't have my phone on. And so the recording or the entry for that day then becomes me saying to her, "Well, can you just tell me that again?" And she says, "Oh, that's the stupidest thing in the world." And I say, well, Melody told me hers again, and, maybe Melody should be my best friend. So, there are those moments. And also where I say to Alan, my husband, every now and then, "What was it that you just said? Can you say that again?" So there's this kind of jokiness about the sort of artificiality of the project too.
Mm. So you're a very active Facebooker with your daughter and your 5 white cats, and you present, I guess, a curated life on Facebook. Obviously, there's quite a long section in the book where Catherine's out to buy a carpet shampooer because the 5 white cats and the daughter do make a mess on the carpet just like everybody else's cats and daughter. But do you think that this found novel is again a sort of a presentation, like of our time, in our times, this thing of the curated life that we present? Is it part of that?
Oh, it definitely plays with that. No, but on Facebook, you're not really allowed to be sad, and the me on Facebook is not the true me, just as the me in The Beat of the Pendulum is not the true me either. But the one in this book, or the version of me in this book, is much more honest and much more raw than anything I would put on Facebook. I mean, you mentioned the smear test that's in there. I made this deal with myself that I wouldn't shy away from whatever the most powerful moment of each day seemed to me to be. That went in the book. My poor husband. But one entry in particular kind of pokes fun at that curated Facebook life. It's the day that the long list for this year's Book Awards was announced, so November last year, and I was on it, and I wanted to say something on Facebook about being on it, but I didn't want to be seen to be boastful. You know how we as Kiwis don't want to be seen to be blowing our own trumpet. And so the entry for that day is me having this conversation with my husband, while we're trying to read Alice a story about how, well, you get on Facebook and announce it then, but make sure that you tag me, so then all of my friends will see it, won't they? And then I won't have to have said it myself. But I end up writing the entry to put on Alan's profile because he's not really a word person, and I can get in there and I can sort of polish it up and make it sound really good. So
Yeah, okay. So, look, I'm feeling a bit selfish that I'm hogging your time and people are probably gasping to ask you a question, but so we'll take one or two from the floor. If there is one, hands up. Okay, that's good. I'll carry on. In one of the sections where you're teaching a class, you say, you tell them, I was here, is the most common piece of graffiti, and that you think that's what creative writing is about, how, telling someone I was here. So how do these two books differ in the way they say, I was here? Degree of difficulty, quite hard.
Well, I guess, The Wish Child is the narrator's insistence on saying, I was here. Like I said, he's sort of flying in the face of the voice of the devil, to that sort of drive to obliterate. So that's what I'm doing in The Wish Child, is to, rescue from the cracks of history a voice that would otherwise have been forgotten. And I guess I'm placing myself much more centre stage with the beat of the pendulum. But it's not so much a book that's saying I was here, it's saying we were here. Like I said, trying to capture my mother's voice and her particular intonations and turns of phrase and obsessions before that's lost, and trying to capture that particular time in a child's life when they are just on the brink of understanding or starting to understand how memory and language work.
Right. You can wave your hand at any point if you do. Oh, here we are, Michael Ann.
Can you tell us about that 13-year writing process and that silence as a writer? Just tell us about that.
So Michael Ann's question was, can you tell us about that 13-year writing process and that silence as a writer? I was writing during that time. I was doing a lot of translating of German children's books, and I wrote a stage play, and I was doing bits and pieces, but the novel just was failing to fire, like I said, until that moment when I discovered the narrator's story. But that was going hand in hand with my husband and I going through infertility and IVF, and then eventually surrogacy, which is how we had Alice. And there's a lot in the beat of the pendulum about, piecing together a non-traditional family. So that was what was going on. I was just kind of stopped in my tracks by being put through that extremely unpleasant mill. Yeah.
The jacket describes the beat of the pendulum as immersive, but I found it was more of a challenge to become immersed in it because there's not a fictional world created. We've discussed that the language flows in a way that you have to kind of intuit. It's not he said, she said, and there's not really a plot to follow. So how do you hope or see that the readers will find this immersive?
I hope that they will be open to reading a new kind of book. I don't think that something like this has quite been done before. I was really excited during the writing of it to feel as if I was treading new ground as an artist, and I hope that the readers will embrace it in that way as well, and to plunge into it without kind of stopping too much to wonder, who was saying that? Because now I find when I read back sections myself, and I wrote it, I'm not quite sure who said what. Like, I have to think very hard. But that doesn't matter too much to me, because one of the points of it is for it to act as a kind of a time capsule, I suppose, and for it to capture, all of the sort of concerns of society at large, like Facebook and like the election of Trump and all the things that were happening in 2016, and to kind of, plunge yourself into that, and to be entertained. I think there's a lot of humour in it too. I hope there is. Yeah.
Right. So we're just about on time, but up to time. But I just thought you've kind of answered this, but I'll put it in a different way. This morning we had an arts panel here on this stage, and Anthony Burt, the writer and critic from Auckland, talked about the role of some of the better dealer galleries in Auckland, where as opposed to the more conservative work in the public gallery, they're prepared to take a more of a risk with work that is more, his words, challenging and difficult. So would you see the beat of the pendulum as taking on that role in the literary world?
I wouldn't call it challenging and difficult. I'd call it different. I don't know. I don't know that that's really for me to say. Any novel is a risk. You know, the Wish Child felt like a huge risk. There are passages in The Beat of the Pendulum where I'm talking to writer friends and saying, oh my God, my whole career is writing on this book, meaning the Wish Child. And, you know, what if people hate it? And, you know, as an artist, you always torture yourself with questions like that about the most traditional of novels and about the most experimental of novels. So I don't think that kind of self-doubt and self-questioning ever stops. And all you can hope for is that readers will be as excited by it and as fired up by it as you were when you were writing it.
Fantastic. Great note to end on. So... Well, I need to thank Page and Blackmore. We'll get to the round of applause in a minute, but I just need to thank Page and Blackmore once again. Mention that Catherine will be down here signing. And thank you once again all for coming. And did Naomi mention there's a podcast? I think she did. Yeah, so you can get to them through the Page and Blackmore page. So thank you for coming to Nelson. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for being a great writer of our time. And let's show our appreciation.